Hello, Herb Grover here. I'm Vice President of the Weminuche Audubon Society and had the privilege of helping coordinate a citizen science project last summer along with Keith Bruno, Southwest Colorado community naturalist for Audubon Rockies, and Gene Cernhelt, President of the Audubon Chapter. You'll be meeting both of those a little bit later on in this video. The citizen science project that we're summarizing in this video was conducted in collaboration with the San Juan Headwaters Forest Health Partnership and a couple of the partnership's member organizations, including the U.S. Forest Service, Pagosa Ranger District, and the Mountain Studies Institute located in Durango, Colorado. The goal of this citizen science project was to examine bird community composition in 3 forested sites that had been subject to prescribed fire or mechanical thinning treatments to reduce wildland fuel loads. These sites are located in south central Colorado in the vicinity of Pagosa Springs. More than 20 volunteers participated in this study, logging more than 400 hours in the field collecting data on the bird communities in these 3 sites. The purpose of this video is to summarize the findings of the first year of this study, which was conducted in 2019, and also to stimulate interest among our members and past and future participants for the second year of this study that we'd like to get started in early June of 2020. The detailed project report can be downloaded from the Weminuche Audubon Society website at the address shown on your screen. Well, let's review the ecological setting for our study. Pagosa Springs, like many mountain communities in the West, is located in what we know as the wildland-urban interface, affectionately known as WUI. This means that residents making up our community intergrade with the surrounding forest, which in our case is dominated by ponderosa pine and other species common to the dry mixed conifer forest type. Dry mixed conifer forests are fire adapted. For thousands of years before European settlement, these forests were subject to frequent but non-destructive cool ground fires that occurred every 5 to 15 years or so. These ground fires, which were likely ignited by lightning strikes or some perhaps by Native Americans, consumed the needle litter and dead branches lying on the forest floor, and in the process thinned out tree seedlings or suppressed woody shrub growth and understory growth, resulting in a forest that was more open and park-like than the forests we see today in many areas. With European settlement, however, natural ground fires were mostly eliminated from the landscape, resulting in what is sometimes called a fire drought. This allowed the accumulation of wildland fuel loads and the increased potential for catastrophic wildfires reaching up into the forest canopy because the shrub layer and tree seedlings and saplings grew up close enough to the canopy that fire could then be carried from the forest floor into the canopy. These are called ladder fuels. This would kill the otherwise fire-resistant trees making up the forest. In response to this mounting hazard, forest managers have increasingly used 3 methods to reduce wildland fuel loads, particularly in the wildland-urban interface. Those methods are prescribed fire, which is a fire that is set purposely when weather conditions allow easy control of those fires, although sometimes they do get away from the managers. The next method is selective harvest, which means you go in and you remove those tree saplings that might be very dense in that forest and chip them up or remove them. The third method is mechanical thinning of the shrub layer. We also call this mastication, which is essentially taking an industrial scale brush hog and driving through the forest and chipping up that shrub layer. Now, the objectives of these management practices are to restore the forest to a more park-like appearance and structure, and secondly, to moderate the probability of catastrophic wildfires in the wildland-urban interface. This has implications, possibly, for the bird community as well, and that's what we're going to talk about next.
Hello, my name is Jean Zernhelt. I am president of the Weminuche Audubon Society. My role in this study was to help organize bird identification workshops and coordinate team assignments. My partner, Charles Martinez, and I comprised one of the sampling teams assigned to the Jackson Mountain area. The implementations of these management practices in the forests around Pagosa Springs prompted several of our local birding enthusiasts to wonder how birds common to our area might respond to forested areas subject to prescribed fire or mechanical thinning, leading to the initiation of this citizen science project. In addition to examining how birds might respond to wildland forest management practices, the project had 4 other complementary goals. One was to promote a better understanding of fire ecology in ponderosa pine forests. Another was to improve birding skills of participants through partnering accomplished birders with less experienced birders. Another was to provide participants with experience in planning and conducting field studies. And finally, to enhance the sense of community among the members of our chapter. So next, let's look at the project design.
Well, let's talk about the project design a little bit. In the map on your screen, you'll see the general location of the 3 sites selected for this study. All 3 sites were of similar elevation and were dominated by ponderosa pine. Now, there are more details that can be found in the project report that we've talked about earlier. The Turkey Springs site, better known to locals as Brockover Mesa, was subject to mastication sometime in the last 5 years or so, but more importantly, was undergoing prescribed fire treatment as this project was being initiated in late May of 2019. The Fawn Gulch site had been masticated in 2017, and there was some evidence, some burn markings and so forth, that indicate prescribed fire had been applied to that site, but not for many years. The Jackson Mountain site was our choice of a non-treated site. As far as we could tell, it had not been subject to logging, thinning, or prescribed fire for many decades. Okay, so at each of these sites, there were 3 loops set up, and you can see those on the detailed map. Each of those loops consisted of 5 monitoring points, and each of those points was about at least 75 meters from any other nearby point. Each team of volunteers was assigned 2 loops at a site, and they were asked to visit those loops at least 4 times over the 5-week duration of this study, which again ran from early June to mid-July of last year. A sampling event consisted of the team visiting each monitoring point on their assigned loops, and at each point they would identify definitively birds that they could see or hear, and they would stay at that point for exactly 6 minutes, and then they would move on to the next point. Now, this methodology is generally consistent with bird monitoring projects that are reported on in the literature. There are some variations, and those are explained and described in the project report. So now let's review how these 3 sites compare to one another with a little bit more detail. Okay, let's take a look at the Turkey Springs site. Now, a map of the Turkey Springs site is shown on your screen, and that illustrates the location of the monitoring points and the loops. Now we sampled the tree vegetation at each site using the point quarter method, and that's described in detail in the project report. Now as we talk about these sites, you'll see some pictures coming up on your screen that give you general views, characteristic views of the sites that we'll be describing. Now our tree sampling revealed that ponderosa pine was the dominant tree species at all 3 sites and was the only tree species sampled at Turkey Springs. Our data indicated about 316 or so, as an estimate, of ponderosa pine trees per acre at the Turkey Springs site, and the shrub layer at Turkey Springs was generally less than 1 to 2 feet tall, and again, remember, it had been basically burned off at the very beginning of our study. The herbaceous understory recovered pretty quickly from the prescribed fire that had taken place in early June. All of this is important because it represents the layers in the forest structure where food resources for various bird species would reside. Okay, now let's move on and take a look at Fawn Gulch.
Hey folks, it's Keith Bruno here at Fawn Gulch. I work as the Southwest Colorado Community Naturalist with Audubon Rockies. I also serve on the board with Herb and Jean at Weminuche Audubon. We do a lot of collaborative work out at the ranch. Weminuche volunteers help me to carry on educational programs for the youth of our region and area. Also, we do a lot of collaborative citizen science. For this project, I've helped where possible and helped Herb develop in the study. Jean and I have done a lot of the bird identification workshops with the chapter, etc. And we help to oversee the teams that need help in the field. That's something last year that was fun for me, was to go back and do point counts. I hadn't done that since my early days doing technician work. So always fun to be out in the field again. Let's see. The map on your screen shows the location of the Fawn Gulch monitoring points. Recall that the shrub layer at this site was mechanically thinned in 2017. There's evidence of prescribed fire prior to that treatment if you look further. Our vegetation sampling revealed a density of ponderosa pine of about 195 trees per acre. That happens to be the lowest density of the 3 sites. So Gamble's oak was present at about 20% of our vegetation sampling points. The overstory was more dispersed at Fawn Gulch than either Turkey Springs or Jackson Mountain. Shrub layer was still quite low in stature, but better developed compared to Turkey Springs, with mature oak clumps distributed across the forest. As we'll discuss coming up, the site had the greatest number of bird species, greatest number of total bird species, the greatest number of bird species unique to this site, and the greatest total number of birds, that's overall individual birds, counted of the 3 sites. We'll see you on at Jackson Mountain.
A map of the Jackson Mountain site is shown on your screen, with monitoring points locations shown. Recall that there is no record of the Jackson Mountain site ever being subject to either mechanical thinning or prescribed fire. There are some tree snags with burn marks, but these are very old. It has likely been several decades since the last fire. As with the other 2 sites, ponderosa pine is the dominant tree species, with about 217 trees per acre. But Jackson Mountain differs from Turkey Springs and Fawn Gulch in having a more diverse tree layer. Our vegetation sampling revealed that Gamble's oak was more mature and more common here than at the other sites. A few aspen and white fir were also encountered on Jackson Mountain. To summarize site characteristics for our 3 locations, ponderosa pine is the dominant tree species at all 3 sites, but it is most dense at Jackson Mountain, followed by Turkey Springs, and was least dense at Fawn Gulch. Jackson Mountain had the most diverse tree canopy. The shrub layer was most dense at Jackson Mountain, followed by Fawn Gulch, and was mostly lacking at Turkey Springs. The average diameter of ponderosa pine was similar across all three sites, at about 16 inches. Now let's see how the bird community responded to these site characteristics.
Okay, so let's look at some of the bird data that we collected. First of all, the findings of our study reveal some interesting patterns in the response of birds to the differences in forest structure characterized by our three study sites and as a consequence of the treatments that they received, or non-treatment in the case of Jackson Mountain. A total of 54 bird species were documented across our three study areas, with more than 900 birds counted. Note that some of the data tables referred to in this video mention data for Fawn Gulch and Fawn Gulch rebalanced. Now this is explained in detail in the project report, but what this reflects is a greater number of site visits at the Fawn Gulch site. And so we went through some machinations to pull some of that data out to make the data from the three sites more comparable. So you'll see a reference, like I said, to this Fawn Gulch rebalanced data set. Anyway, what we've found out is that Fawn Gulch has the greatest number of bird species and the greatest number of birds counted by a substantial margin, and the greatest number of bird species unique to that site, and we'll be talking about that some more as we move along. Now, of the 54 bird species identified in this study, 15 were found at all three sites. If we sum up the number of points where these 15 species were recorded, or sum up the total number of birds counted for those species across all three sites, we arrive at about 70% for both measures, again, at all three sites. It's kind of interesting. Now, many ecological studies report similar patterns, whether studying birds, plants, or insects. What that means is that a few species are typically common, with a greater number of species present in lower numbers or lower densities.
Not surprisingly, the American robin was the most common species cited at the three sites. Northern flickers and western wood peewees were the only other species in the top 5 at all three sites.
Now, as we move forward, we'll start to talk more about what species were unique at each of these locations. Well, in addition to having markedly fewer bird species, Turkey Springs had the fewest number of species unique to that site, only 3. Notable among the unique species at Turkey Springs were the Lewis's woodpecker and McGillivray's warbler. Lewis's woodpecker is often seen in the Pagosa area, but with a global population estimated at only around 69,000 birds, this species is of significant concern to conservation biologists. McGillivray's warbler is more elusive, but its population numbers are also declining at an alarming rate. If you look in our project report, there's a table 7, which summarizes in detail the conservation status of all of the species that were identified in this study. Observers at Turkey Springs were also excited to find a nesting pair of common nighthawks, along with their primitive-looking ground nest, and they tracked the eggs in this nest to hatching. Thanks go to Daryl Safer and Diane Saxena for capturing these photos of the nighthawk. Jackson Mountain had the second highest total number of bird species and 7 species unique to that site. Notable among the unique species at Jackson Mountain is Virginia's warbler. This is another species that is of great concern to conservation biologists, with a population of only about 950,000 worldwide. The skill and patience of Jean Cernhelt and her partner Charles Martinez paid off with several beautiful pictures of nesting birds, including the house wren and the Plumbeus vireo at the Jackson Mountain site. With between 40 and 34 total species, depending on whether you consider the total or rebalanced data set at Fawn Gulch, this site had the greatest total number of bird species. Fawn Gulch also had 14 bird species unique to that site. Notable among these is the Cason's finch, which is considered to be a threatened species due to habitat destruction. And the Fawn Gulch site also hosted a nesting pair of northern flickers that were regularly observed by teams monitoring that site. Thanks go to Brenda and Bill Bredding for capturing the flickers in action at the Fawn Gulch site. Well, what are the overall findings, the takeaways for our 2019 field season? Well, first of all, our results indicate that a ponderosa pine forest undergoing recovery from wildland fuel management practices may present the most favorable habitat for a broader range of bird species. Of course, we're talking about the Fawn Gulch site. Now, you compare that to the Turkey Spring site, which has just been treated and is just starting that recovery process. That site had the fewest number of bird species. And then also the Jackson Mountain site, which is essentially an over-mature forest, had an intermediate number of bird species in our data set. Now, the details of this analysis can be found in our complete report, but we should note that our findings are generally consistent with other studies that are reported in the literature. What are some of our final thoughts, Jean?
Well, one, Herb, is that wildland fuel reduction treatments simplify forest composition and structure in the near term.
Yeah, and this simplification may contribute to a near-term reduction in bird species diversity and numbers, but the recovery seems to be pretty rapid within just a few years.
Thanks, Herb. And also, long-term absence of natural fires or mechanical thinning prescription fire treatments, as you would see at Jackson Mountain, may contribute to a decline in bird species richness and abundance.
Well, overall, the broad scale picture that we see is that landscape heterogeneity or patchiness, which is represented by these three sites of different qualities, likely favors, again, broad scale resilience of the bird community. And what that means is it's a good idea to maintain our prescribed fire programs and mastication programs that not only protects residences in the wildland urban interface, but overall may have a positive impact on bird community across the region.
We need to know more about year-to-year variability in bird community composition. Note that 2019 was a record wet year with a cool spring. 2020 is shaping up to be more normal.
An additional field season will help us understand how birds respond to differences in seasonal weather patterns, and we'll be able to observe how the bird community responds to recovery of the Turkey Spring site 1 year after prescribed fire.
Well, we hope you find these results of the project interesting, and that those of you in the Pagosa Springs area will join us and participate in continuing on this season in 2020.
Watch for further announcements about the 2020 field team research on the Weminuche Audubon Society website and our Weminuche Audubon Facebook page.
Good. Well, thanks to Keith and Jean for helping out with this video and for working so hard on the project throughout the year. So bye for now, and we wish you all a wonderful and rewarding spring birding season wherever you are. Hey, what's that?
It's that pesky pygmy nuthatch.
Yeah, great job, everybody.
Bye.